Good day, sir. So I will present to you my case analysis with the topic Philippines debt. Let's begin with the introduction. The national government debt or public debt is the financial liabilities shouldered by the Philippine government. These are unpaid borrowed funds from domestic and external sources. If the funds are borrowed from domestic residents, they are considered domestic debts. However, if the borrowings are from foreign sources, they fall under external debts. As stated in a Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism article, the Philippines has no choice but to incur these debts. Governments always borrow money from domestic and foreign sources to finance public projects. Most of these years, extra borrowings were mainly used to finance the country's COVID response. So Philippine debt has an effect on investments. Hence, the immediate effects of high Philippine debt is the high interest rates. According to experts, having a growing debt means being vulnerable to interest rates. This is especially concerning now the US is rethinking its current lenient debt policies. In addition, a growing debt paired with the gross domestic product or GDP slowdown can increase the country's debt to GDP ratio, a measure of its capacity to repay its total debt. Should foreign lenders impose higher interest rates, it might impact investment portfolios. Stock returns become for one more government bonds may drive up interest rates and decrease stock market returns. If there is a surplus of new bonds in the supply market with more attractive interest rates, old bonds tend to yield lower stock market returns. So in the statement of the problem or the focus problem in this topic is debt surges continue to affect the Philippine economic progress. Debt surges tend to be followed by weaker economic growth and persistently lower output. However, this negative relationship does not always hold. Surges in public debt tend to have the most negative impact on future growth prospects. This is particularly the case if the economy is already operating with a large positive output gap. Debt surges also tend to be followed by weaker economic growth if the initial debt levels are high, especially for private debt surges. Our results also show how debt surges impact the future growth. So public debt surges are associated with especially weaker private and public investments. Although both private and public consumption are also negatively affected, surges in corporate debt are followed by lower private and public investment. So debt surges tend to be followed by weaker economic growth and persistently lower output. However, this negative relationship does not always hold. Surges in public debt tend to have the most negative impact on future growth prospects. This is particularly the case if the economy is already operating with a large positive output gap. Debt surges also tend to be followed by weaker economic growth if the initial debt levels are high, especially for private debt surges. Our results also show how debt surges impact for future growth. Public debt surges are associated with especially weaker private and public investments. Although both private and public consumption are also negatively affected. Surges in corporate debt are followed by lower private and public investments. Future generation will suffer from the environmental degradation accelerated by the debt problem. Only one-fifth of Philippine forest is left, partly to massive exportation and smuggling of logs and other forest products for the sake of generating desperately needed foreign exchange. Whole mountains are being torn up and formerly productive rivers and lakes are being destroyed by export-oriented gold and copper mines and other industries. Only one quarter of Philippine coral reefs is in good condition, and fisheries production has dropped by a half as a result of the use of cyanide, dynamite, and other destructive forms of fishing. In an article published by the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, J.C. Punongbayan, Marian Vital, and Jeff Arapok of Usapang Econ explained how sources of debt play a role in determining whether Filipinos should worry about the national debt. So the second problem in this topic is management practices causes the increase of poverty in the Philippines. There had not been an office dedicated to public debt audit in the Philippines since 2002. By this time, most auditors at the COA had limited to no experience with debt audit work. If the COA was going to start monitoring borrowing practices in the country to help head off coming financial storms, then the organization stops would need to drastically improve their capacity for conducting debt audits. And quickly, the COA conducted a pilot audit on the legal frameworks and organizational management of public debt. The audit found the Philippines lacked legislation which clearly laid down public debt and borrowing objectives. So the burden of the debt contracted by the government of the Philippines is borne by the poor, who pay for it in terms of reduced incomes and underfunding of the health and education services on which they depend in stock terms. The debt leads to deprivation and marginalization, wasted lives, and even death. The only way to lower the deficit will be to implement high tax rates and reduce federal spending. The situation will result in a lower disposable income for Filipinos, whether high tax rates reduce their paycheck and incentive to work, or whether future administration cuts expenses by reducing social security benefits. So that is the two problems or the focus problems of this case analysis. So my two alternative course of action is interest rate manipulation. Maintaining interest rates at low levels is another way that governments seek to stimulate the economy, generate tax revenue, and ultimately reduce the national debt. Lower interest rates make it easier for individuals and businesses to borrow money. In turn, those borrowers spend that money on goods and services, which create jobs and tax revenues. To help weigh on the government debt instead of focusing on the debt figures, Kimball advised to look first at the country's debt to GDP ratio, which compares a country's debt to its financial output. It is possible that the country has a huge debt but also has a high output. That means the country can pay on its debt. So lower interest rates make it cheaper to borrow. This tends to encourage spending and investment. This leads to higher aggregate demand and economic growth. This increase in AD may also cause inflationary